Well, welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is May 12, 2024, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's an honor to welcome in discussion members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. As always, to contribute your thoughts to our discussion today, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. And for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. So that everyone has a chance to speak, I'll call on you in the order that hands are raised, using first name only. Once we finish recording in 2 hours, I invite anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. This is the 8th meeting of our series on Plato's longest dialogue, The Laws, which features 3 characters, an unnamed Athenian, Clinias from Crete, and Megillus from Sparta, discussing the ideal constitution for Crete's new colony to be called Magnesia. Today we'll be reading Book 5, in which only the Athenian speaks, and begins with a powerful and empowering exposition on the eternal nature of the soul. He refers to the soul as the master in us, as he extols the soul's timeless value and the honor that we should accord to it. The soul features prominently, of course, in Plato's dialogues, but many people believe that whatever name we apply to that immaterial power in us, it comes to be only after the body is born, and that it dies with the body. The Athenian presents a very different view, that the body is not preeminent and is not the master, but that the soul reigns supreme in us as that which never dies and is endowed with reason that is, as we heard in our first 2 episodes on Book 10, the cause and the center of the universe. So although Book 5 is relatively short, there is a great deal in it, and it makes numerous references to themes in other dialogues of Plato. After we consider the Athenian's opening speech on the soul, we can discuss what he says about the soul's motivations to do good, that it should be driven by a desire to benefit others more than for its own benefit and love of self. What do we think of his claim, beginning at 731e, that, quote, the cause of each and every crime we commit is precisely this excessive love of ourselves, a love which blinds us to the fault of the beloved and makes us bad judges of goodness and beauty and justice, because we believe we should honor our own ego rather than the truth. So the first 4 books of Plato's Laws emphasize that Crete's new colony is to be founded with the aim of promoting virtue among the citizens. And in the second theme we'll turn to today, the Athenian discusses the means by which the community can be purged of disharmony in order to maintain its virtue. In this, he says that we should honor earth and nature as our mistress and treat it with respect, which is a perspective many are now trying to promote to address the climate crisis that humanity has brought upon itself. The Athenian also explores the theory of money, as he cautions against debasing the soul's value in the search for monetary wealth, and says that poverty is a matter of increased greed rather than diminished wealth. Again, he reminds us that the challenge in life is achieving a balance between pleasure and pain. We naturally seek the former and shun the latter, but if we don't apply reason to the unbridled pursuit of immediate pleasure, leads to imbalance and a life of torment. We'll end our discussion today with the Athenian's commentary on the distribution of the value that accrues to the community with a fair and equitable division that will be perceived as just. In this, he makes a fascinating and historically curious proposal that the ideal number for the division of land and houses in a community is 5,040. Bearing in mind the consistent focus of the first 4 books of the Laws on the benefits of harmony in a virtuous community and Plato's skill as a geometer, I've incorporated a lengthy footnote in the notes for today's discussion that are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. I'd love to explore in depth, with anyone who wishes, the connection of the number 5,040 to harmonics and to the respective proportion and measurement, which is a recurring theme of the Laws. So I'll start today's session on the soul and its harmony in the community with the Athenian's opening speech on the soul from 726a to 728c. So the Athenian says, everyone who is listening to the address just now about the gods and our dearly beloved ancestors should now pay attention. Of all the things a man can call his own, the holiest, though the gods are holier still, is his soul, his most intimate possession. There are 2 elements that make up the whole of every man. One is stronger and superior and acts as master. The other, which is weaker and inferior, is a slave. And so a man must always respect the master in him in preference to the slave. Thus, when I say that next after the gods, our masters, and their attendant spirits, a man must honor his soul, my recommendation is correct. But hardly a man among us honors it in the right way. He only thinks he does. You see, nothing that is evil can confer honor, because to honor something is to confer marvelous benefits upon it. And anyone who reckons he is magnifying his soul by flattery or gifts or indulgence, so that he fails to make it better than it was before, may think that he is honoring it, but in fact, that is not what he is doing at all. For instance, a person has only to reach adolescence to imagine he is capable of deciding everything. He thinks he is honoring his soul if he praises it, and he is only too keen to tell it to do what it likes. But our present doctrine is that in doing this, he is not honoring but harming it, whereas we are arguing that he should honor it next after the gods. Similarly, when a man thinks that the responsibility for his every fault lies not in himself, but in others, whom he blames for his most frequent and serious misfortunes, while exonerating himself, he doubtless supposes he is honoring his soul. But far from doing that, he is injuring it. Again, when he indulges his pleasure and disobeys the recommendations and advice of the legislator, he is not honoring his soul at all, but dishonoring it by filling it with misery and repentance. Or to take the opposite case, he may not brace himself to endure the recommended toils and fears and troubles and pains and simply give up. But his surrender confers no honor on his soul, because all such conduct brings disgrace on it. Nor does he do it any honor if he thinks that life is a good thing no matter what the cost. This too dishonors his soul, because he surrenders to its fancy that everything in the next world is an evil, whereas he should resist the thought and enlighten his soul by demonstrating that he does not really know whether our encounter with the gods in the next world may not in fact be the best thing that ever happens to us. And when a man values beauty above virtue, the disrespect he shows his soul is total and fundamental, because he would argue that the body is more to be honored than the soul, falsely, because nothing born on earth is to be honored more than what comes from heaven. And anyone who holds a different view of the soul does not realize how wonderful is this possession which he scorns. Again, a man who is seized by lust to obtain money by improper means and feels no disgust in the acquisition will find that in the event he does his soul no honor by such gifts. Far from it, he sells all that gives the soul its beauty and value for a few paltry pieces of gold. But all the gold upon earth and all the gold beneath it does not compensate for lack of virtue. To sum up, the legislator will list and classify certain things as disgraceful and wicked, and others as fine and good. Everyone who is not prepared to make all efforts to refrain from the one kind of action and practice the other to the limits of his power must be unaware that in all such conduct he is treating his soul, the most holy possession he has, in the most disrespectful and abominable manner. You see, practically no one takes into account the greatest judgment, as it is called, on wrongdoing. This is to grow to resemble men who are evil, and as a resemblance increases, to shun good men and their wholesome conversation, and to cut oneself off from them, while seeking to attach oneself to the other kind and keep their company. The inevitable result of consorting with such people is that what you do and have done to you is exactly what they naturally do and say to each other. Consequently, this condition is not really a judgment at all, because justice and judgment are fine things. It is mere punishment, suffering that follows a wrongdoing. Now, whether a man is made to suffer or not, he is equally wretched. In the former case, he is not cured. In the latter, he will be ultimately killed to ensure the safety of many others. So I wanted to start with that, almost like a sermon on the soul and the nature of the soul and how we have to value it and how that really translates into the basis of the Constitution for this new colony, Magnesia, that Crete will be setting up. And I wanted to call attention to this part that I have highlighted here on the screen. That last part that I read, no one takes into account the greatest judgment, as it is called, on wrongdoing. This is to grow to resemble men who are evil, and as a resemblance increases, to shun good men and their wholesome conversation. And this really reminded me of a great passage in the Theaetetus, where it said that the greatest evil is not to be able to reflect on yourself anymore, is to become like those who are themselves evil, and to lose your own capability of judgment to guide yourself through life. And there's many references to other dialogues throughout this book, in particular, book 5. And so I've footnoted a few of them, but this one in particular really struck me. So I'm wondering what we think of this opening of book 5, what it says, and in terms of whether the soul is in fact this master. I think, those who think that the soul is born with the body and dies with the body may think that the body is more the master. But here he's saying that the immaterial is the master. The body is the slave of the soul, is what he says at the opening of this. So, any thoughts on this in terms of what we've talked about already in the laws? We started with Book 10, where reason is the center of the universe and is the cause of the universe. It's the first thing before the physical universe. And here he's extending it to the soul. I can go on and read another part here from 729b to 730a. And this one really struck me as a bit of a lesson for our time. There's some themes in here that really seem to resonate today, 2,400 years later. And so, again, with the theme of cultivating the soul or honoring the soul, the Athenian says, extreme modesty, not gold, is the legacy we should leave our children. We imagine that the way to bequeath them modesty is to rebuke them when they are immodest. But that is not the result produced in the young when people admonish them nowadays and tell them that youth must show respect to everyone. The sensible legislator will prefer to instruct the older men to show respect to their juniors, and to take especial care not to let any young man see or hear them doing or saying anything disgraceful. Where the old are shameless, the young too will inevitably be disrespectful to a degree. The best way to educate the younger generation, as well as yourself, is not to rebuke them, but patently to practice all your life what you preach to others. If a man honors and respects his relatives, who all share the worship of the family gods and have the same blood in their veins, he can reasonably expect to have the gods of birth look with benevolence on the procreation of his own children. And as for friends and companions, you will find them easier to get on with in day-to-day contact if you make more of their services to you and esteem them more highly than they do, and put a smaller value on your own good turns to your friends and companions than they do themselves. In dealings with the state and one's fellow citizens, the best man by far is the one who, rather than win a prize at Olympia or in any of the other contests in war and peace, would prefer to beat everyone by his reputation for serving the laws of his country, a reputation for having devoted a lifetime of service to them with more distinction than anything else. As to foreigners, one should regard agreements made with them as particularly sacrosanct. Practically all offenses committed as between or against foreigners are quicker to attract the vengeance of God than offenses as between fellow citizens. The foreigner is not surrounded by friends and companions, and stirs the compassion of gods and men that much more, so that everyone who has the power to avenge him comes to his aid more readily, and that power is possessed preeminently by the guardian spirit or god, companion of Zeus, the god of strangers, who is concerned in each case. Anyone who takes the smallest thought for the future will therefore take great care to reach the end of his days without having committed during his life any crime involving foreigners. The most serious of offenses against foreigners or natives is always that affecting suppliants. The god the victim supplicated and invoked when he won his promise becomes a devoted protector of his suppliant, who can consequently rely on the promise he received never to suffer without vengeance being taken for the wrongs done to him. And there was two things in here, I think, really that speak to our time. This idea at the end about being particularly careful in our relations with foreigners. We live now in a world where nations want to put up walls to keep foreigners away. We want to protect what we have and to keep what we have away from foreigners. And here, this is a very different view. This is to be generous and magnanimous to foreigners. And then the other thing, the part that started this section at 729b is the idea that where the old are shameless, the young too will inevitably be disrespectful to a degree. And this, I think, is a case where perhaps our constitutions, our modern constitutions, don't necessarily cultivate virtue. And so we think that we can do as we please, that we can be free to do as we please. And yet here he's saying that no, that's really not doing any service to the younger generation. We have to set an example. And so I thought those two things were kind of interesting to think about here in the year 2024. So we'll start with Fred. Your thoughts, Fred?
His notions of being particularly honorable to foreigners is in reference to the Greek practice of philoxenia, the friendship and the hospitality, particularly towards guests and visitors from foreign lands.
Yeah, so that's an interesting connection to the cultural practice of the time, and something that perhaps has kind of waned maybe over time. We may welcome family and immediate friends, but maybe not people that we don't know closely. That's a helpful cultural reference, I think, to the practices of the time. Darren, your thoughts?
Just a quick comment on what Fred said. You also don't want to piss off Zeus because he's the god of strangers, apparently, according to the text. So that's another, I guess, reason. Yeah, so regarding these passages in the opening of this book about the soul, I really like this section. I thought it was really telling about the well, let me rewind. Okay, so the title of the meetup you provided, I thought was really fitting. So it's a soul in the harmony of community. So I think that just captures the spirit of this first section really well, because the ethics here is not just about like you as an individual and how to make your life the best, although maybe that's a sort of maybe long-term after effect. We can discuss that in the context of the dialogue later. But it's about you and ethics within the context of the community and other people. And that doesn't always come through in ancient ethics or even in Plato's ethics, but I think it's really apparent here. And maybe not surprisingly, because, we have the legislator trying to create the laws for a new community. So that makes sense. And how, like, the discussion here really foregrounds a kind of humility, as he says here, like extreme modesty, not goal, is the legacy we should leave our children. And how, like, in our relationships with friends, we should make more of their services to you and esteem them more highly than they do, and vice versa. Put a smaller value in your own good turns to your friends. So yeah, so there's a really, just coursing through this whole discussion, there's a spirit of, as you said before, like a kind of generosity. Yeah, even in the discussion of the soul, like that just sort of kicks off book 5 that you read. Like he says that we actually dishonor our soul when we try to exonerate ourselves from all kinds of blames, and we only find the blame in other people, and we sort of exempt ourselves, and we flatter ourselves. And just in general, I just feel like, well, the title of the meetup you put up captures this really well. It's a view of the soul and ethics in the harmony of community, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's just, yeah, my thought for
Mm-hmm.
now.
Yeah, and interesting that you mentioned this idea of generosity, and that, are we actually capable of judging our own behavior? I think is maybe part of the issue. And, and it goes maybe back to this consistent theme of measurement throughout this dialogue. And it keeps referring back in many ways, I think, to the Theaetetus, which is about the claim of the sophist Protagoras that man is the measure of all things. I think here it's saying man is the measure least of all of himself. And so I think this is why the motivation the Athenian is saying at the beginning here is not to do things for your own benefit or to be generous for the ultimate benefit of yourself, but to benefit others more than you benefit yourself. And if everybody were to do that, of course, then the world would be a great place, I guess. So I wonder, is there anything in that first part of this passage from 726a to 728c, is there anything that we could object to in there? I mean, we have, I guess, in our societies now, the sense that maybe, or at least in the Western societies, the ones that try to operate democratically, the idea that maybe personal freedom is paramount. But here it's something I think quite different. It's a lot more geared to the community. And is there anything that we find objectionable in this opening passage? Or anything that we can use to inform our discussions now and in today's world? Fred.
I think, as is often the case, there's not much that you can find objectionable to the notions of virtue that are listed here when it pertains to individuals, how individuals should act virtuously. But as is often the case with Plato, the potential objections, at least in modern Western societies, is, as you alluded, how does it scale up to government? How should government act? And that's a whole different question, because the modus operandi of government is always force. How do you constrain other people? And it is the virtue, actually, of Western, or should be the virtue of democratic societies, that they do not materially reward individuals on the basis of their virtue. So that it's fine, for example, for governments to encourage via education and inculcate notions of private virtue, but not for legislators to weigh the virtue of its citizens and reward them accordingly. And the reason is that it is open to corruption, that individuals who reward others on the basis of their virtue by using force to extract money or power from other people inevitably tend to use it for their own self-interest in the name of rewarding public virtue. So there is this pragmatic argument that I think shows up in Lockean theories of government and democracy, that it is a particularly virtuous feature of government that it does not materially reward the virtuous behavior of its citizens. Rather, it enables it through the enforcement of natural rights that allows them to be virtuous. That's all.
Yeah, really excellent points that you make there. I like that question that you started with. How does it scale up to the level of government, especially if the government is seen as a force that is maybe apart from the people, which is maybe how it's come to be seen now, rather than, the maybe Lincoln's concept of government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's the people against the government. And, as governments grow larger, I guess this becomes the way we perceive it. But I think, maybe part of the problem too is that we don't reward legislators who are virtuous. We reward legislators who are good at, appealing to the public, or, good showmen. And, there's legislators without any experience ruling now. There's all sorts of different things that I think we're seeing here a very different type of government for the colony of Magnesia than the type of governments that we have now. And maybe it's not the type of government that would reward virtue, but cultivate virtue. So not necessarily picking winners and losers, but doing the utmost to cultivate virtue and being virtuous itself. And it's a very difficult thing, as they say in this book, to have that. But it's an ideal that the Athenian says we should keep in mind. So yeah, very good points. Thank you. And Darren.
Yeah, that's a really big question that Fred raised. I think another issue in modern times is that there's pluralism about our view of what the good life is and what virtue is. So in the public realm, I think there's a bracketing of that, like to leave those issues on the side and just focus on, like, well, as Fred said, like pragmatic issues of governance. I mean, we do sort of have to remember that, I think if you look at the history of liberalism and how it evolved, it was as a result of like clashes of religions and worldviews that people started to think, okay, well, maybe we should just have freedom of religion and this kind of pluralism and keep those issues out of that political life. But anyway, I think that's a very big topic. So I wanted to come back to, or what we were discussing earlier about the community-centered nature of this ethics. I just feel like it's worth maybe pressing this point a bit more, because for people, familiar with, debates about ancient ethics, there is a critique of tendencies in ancient ethics to be egotistical. like Bernard Williams had this famous critique of ethical theories that he calls like morally self-indulgent or involves self-absorption, where the ethics is ultimately about you. It's not actually, it's about like your own happiness or your eudaimonia. So the explanation for the virtues ultimately comes down to you and your satisfaction, however that is fleshed out. And Bernard Williams argued that this is precisely actually not virtuous. I mean, if you're only helping others for your own good and for your own satisfaction or happiness or eudaimonia, however that's fleshed out, then that he would argue that's precisely not virtuous. So I just think it's worth highlighting that the view that Plato is presenting here is actually totally against this objection to a tendency in ancient ethics to be, very self-absorbed and self-indulgent and egotistical. Because that alternative often has to do with, I think, the concern with one's own status in one's community. Like you want to be recognized as being the virtuous person. Like it's about like your status in the community and being seen as virtuous. I think that was a kind of concern within that world, which is seen in a lot of the philosophy ethics of the time. But like Plato's actually presenting a different ethos here regarding ethics. So I don't know. I just thought it might be worth just pointing out that this is a little bit different than the thing that sometimes people critique ancient ethics for. Like he's saying here that, for instance, like this thing you read was really great. He says that the virtuous person must admire not himself and his own possessions, but acts of justice, not only when they are his own, but especially when they happen to be done by someone else. And also like avoiding excessive love of ourselves, which sometimes often seems to be in alternative kinds of ethics, seem to be the point. Like it's to create this aesthetic sense of your own beauty or whatever. And then he says here, like not blaming other people and also accepting part of the blame. Like there's a lot of humility here and modesty that may be surprising for people who read ancient ethics. It feels a bit more Christian, actually, like the discussion here than ancient ethics. So anyway, I just thought I'll bring that contrast, and people can make it of what they will, but I think there is a kind of something interesting here about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like the way you use the term self-indulgent ethics, and the idea that one does good in order to gain recognition and to advance one's own status in society. I think that's something that is done a lot. And here he's talking about something that's selfless because the universe itself has a soul, according to Plato. And so if we each have souls, then we're part of the universe's soul. And so how can we be fundamentally selfish? We have to participate as part of the whole rather than just as individual disconnected beings. I'm wondering if we are living in a world now where that's kind of the way things are done, or the way we have these legislators who are actually quite shameless. We see a number of legislators who are very shameless now and not setting a good example for the young. They're seeking the best immediate result for themselves and their supporters. How do we change the world if that's the way the world has become? How do we get the message to the world that there is another way of looking at things? So I'll throw that question out there. Fred, your thoughts?
One of the answers to that question, briefly, is not to emulate people in positions of power, period. Don't look for your salvation from individuals. Foster your own ethics. What I wanted to raise is in this really naughty Knotty naughty question is, again, to unfortunately delve into pragmatics, is the accommodation that you have to make to non-virtuous behavior, because life and ethics is messy. For example, if you're involved in private nonprofits, you often have to come to grips as volunteers, like in the volunteer work I've done with nonprofits and myself on a limited budget. You often have to come to grips that the lifeblood of those nonprofits is private donations from wealthy individuals. And that's just the way it is. And often the events that you sponsor for those wealthy individuals are perhaps as much in their individual self-interest to make contacts and enjoy nice dinners and schmooze with their fellow rich people than it is out of pure generosity on their part. You have to come to grips with that and recognize that, okay, in the realistic nature of the world, it is actually a feasible position for them to do that if they have limited time on a limited time budget. If you do not offer them opportunities to schmooze with other rich people while they are donating their time and, more importantly, their money to these worthy nonprofits, then the alternative is not that they donate purely out of generosity, but rather that they more than likely will simply not attend and not donate. So is it really so terrible that they effectively kill two birds with one stone and get to schmooze with their friends and show off their own private virtue if it in fact benefits ultimately the nonprofit? And so sometimes when you're as a volunteer, you can feel like it's a little bit cheesy that you're offering your services and you don't have much money and you actually don't have much time, but you're offering volunteering your services to elicit from them money by making it possible for them to satisfy both of those objectives, and possibly even primarily the objective of hobnobbing with friends if it benefits your nonprofit. So these are really, again, really knotty issues of trying to untangle motivations in ethics. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually, of something that's become very prominent in the world these days is, of course, recognition of wealthy donors, whether it's at events or they get their name on a building or, I think the whole movement to, I guess, effective altruism is one of these movements. So some very wealthy people in the world are trying to do good things and, maybe completely selflessly, but at the same time, they are choosing which causes to support with a lot of money. And there are many volunteers, as you say, who don't have money and who may have other causes that are important, and yet they don't get to have the same effect as the very wealthy do, and they don't get to make the kind of choice that the very wealthy have a chance to do. And this raises the whole question of money. And there is a lot of talk in this book about money, so we'll get to that shortly. I think the Athenian is being very clear here that money is really a problem rather than a solution. And this is something that maybe in our own modern economies, I mean, I think when we talked about book 3, actually, George commented on how Plato's writing really is a commentary on political economy. And that's something that we can keep in mind, I think, as we read his work. So, yeah, I really liked what you said. All right, well, maybe let me read this next part here. This is where I start the second theme of the discussion today, this whole idea of disharmony in the community of souls and purging disharmony. And this is just maybe kind of introducing the idea here, this section 733E to 734C. And this is reminding us that this constant tension between pain and pleasure, and the legislator has to have a good control on pain and pleasure, where the ordinary people, I think we heard it was book 4, I think, most people don't necessarily think that far ahead with their pursuit of pleasure, but it's the role of the legislator to do that kind of forward thinking and to have some control on that. And so this is maybe just a bit of a reminder before we get into this idea of purging the community of disharmony, of the issues of living with pleasure. So 733E, the Athenian starts, "So when a man has considered his likes and dislikes, what he would willingly do and what not, and adopted that as a working rule to guide him in choosing what he finds congenial and pleasant and supremely excellent, he will select a life that will enable him to live as happily as a man can. So what are those lives, and how many are there from which he must make his choice? Let us list them. There is a life of self-control for one, the life of wisdom for another, and the life of courage too. And let us treat the healthy life as another. As opposed to these, we have another four lives: the licentious, the foolish, the cowardly, and the diseased. Now, anyone who knows what the life of self control is like will describe it as gentle in all respects, with mild pleasures and pains, light appetites and desires without frenzy. The licentious life, he will say, is violent through and through, involving extreme pleasures and pains, intense and raging appetites, and desires of extreme fury. He will say that in the life of self control, the pleasures outweigh the pains, and in the licentious life, the pains exceed the pleasures in point of size, number, and frequency. That is why we inevitably and naturally find the former life more pleasant, the latter more painful, and anyone who means to live a pleasant life no longer has the option of living licentiously. On the contrary, it is already clear, if our present position is correct, that if a man is licentious, it must be without intending to be. It is either because of ignorance or lack of self control, or both, that the world at large lives immoderately. The healthy and unhealthy life should be regarded in the same way. They both offer pleasures and pains, but the pleasures outweigh the pains in the healthy life, vice versa in the unhealthy. And this part, I think, is talking again about measuring the consequences of what we do over time. I wanted to just read, there was another part here which I didn't put in the notes, but it's just a short part. This is at 731 C to D, where the Athenian says, "Every unjust man is unjust against his will. No man on earth would ever deliberately embrace any of the supreme evils, least of all in the most precious parts of himself. And as we said, the truth is that the most precious part of every man is his soul. So no one will ever voluntarily accept the supreme evil into that most valuable part of himself and live with it throughout his life. No, in general, the unjust man deserves just as much pity as any other sufferer." I'm wondering what you think of that. I remember a few meetings ago, Fai Wu brought up the question of whether man is kind of inherently flawed. Do we kind of inherently seek these immediate pleasures at the cost of maybe a lot of damage? Is it true that every unjust man is unjust against his will? Do we come into this life equipped with justice? Fred, and then Darren.
Well, I just suggest that I wish Plato had used footnotes, because if he did, he would have a footnote, I think, to Protagoras here, where he develops this idea at length, because I don't think he really develops it here at all. But the justification for that notion that no one is willingly unjust or evil is developed in that other dialogue. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I think this is, again, with the laws, I think as Michael F. has told us a few times, is that the laws are really a compendium of all of Plato's works. And so it kind of presupposes some of the knowledge of the earlier works that Plato did. And this is really kind of the graduate course for his students in the academy. And so, as I said, I see a lot of connections to other dialogues in this one. Certainly, as I said, the connection to the Theaetetus, whether man is the measure of all things. I put on the front page of the notes, actually, a couple of points here which I think really resonate in this dialogue in particular. And I'll remind, it was in book 4, I guess, that we read this great line. It was 707D. "We do not hold the common view that a man's highest good is to survive and simply continue to exist. His highest good is to become as virtuous as possible and to continue to exist in that state as long as life lasts." I mean, that's a very different idea, I think, than what we experience now. And I also wanted to just call attention to Socrates in the Apology, where at 30C in the Apology he says, "Be sure that if you kill the sort of man I say I am, you will not harm me more than yourselves." He's talking about their souls. He's not concerned. The soul never dies. Socrates knows that his soul will continue on. He's worried about the souls of those who are going to kill him. So thanks for that, Darren.
So I don't know if might be opening a huge can of worms here. So this is my first time reading this book and this dialogue in general. So I'm trying to process it and understand it. So I actually found So, in the first part of the discussion, we discussed how Plato's presenting sort of a general perspective on ethics that's very humble, modest, about, our personal modesty, and it's about our connection with other people and how to live well together, and not just about our own status or how much more virtuous we are compared to other people, and and our own happiness or pleasure or eudaimonia or whatever. It's very community centered. In fact, one thing, I don't know if we're going to come back to this in your notes, but just let me footnote another thing regarding this, which I thought was really cool. So when he described like what the virtuous person should be like, he says how truth should be at the list of all things. Like that should be
Yeah,
what we
that's
keep
at
our eyes on.
730 C.
Yeah,
Truth heads the list of all things good for gods and men alike.
yeah. And I'm assuming like truth will also include, for Plato, like there's no distinction there between truth and the idea of the good. But then there was this really interesting part later on. So I just have these in my notes. I'm trying to find the text, but it is just after that part. Um, okay, it talks about good judgment and how he should communicate this to other people. And if he does communicate them, he should be honored as in the top rank. If he is prepared to communicate them but lacks ability, he must be left second place. But if he's jealous fellow and churlishly wants to monopolize his virtues, then we should certainly censure him. I just found this idea that even for this idea of the truth, and he includes like he's talking about good judgment here, that he says here that we should communicate it with other people. So it's not like something to like hold for yourself, like he says, guarding it jealously,
Yeah.
as if it's our own possession. That even our relationship to the truth should be part of this community. I thought that was a little part that was interesting. Anyway, that's just sort of
Yeah.
just a little footnote to this idea that the virtues being described here in approach to ethics is very community oriented and not like self-centered and self-obsessed at all. However, so that was our first part of the book 5 and our discussion, but then like I actually found this later section you read to be not very satisfactory, because then he reverts to this discussion of pain and pleasure, and how like if you live a virtuous life, it will be the most pleasant and satisfactory life for you, and you'll be the most happy, you'll be infinitely more happy even. And so like we actually discussed this before, so I don't think we had to spend too much time on this again, because I distinctly remember, I think this was like back in book 2, and Michael was with us. I remember debating this at the time when the Athenian actually tried to argue this, actually more like in a more sort of vigorous dialectic manner, that virtue would lead to happiness. But then Clinias himself was resisting this idea. He was like, no, 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 I can't accept, this is a weird idea, I can't accept it. So I think my own resistance to this idea that like being virtuous will give you the most pleasure, and that would be a reason to be happier, and that will give you a reason to be virtuous. I think like Plato himself recognizes difficulty, right? Like we know like from Republic Book 1, the story of Thrasymachus, he's the one who's this corrupt, dictator who can have access all the pleasures or whatever. And then people in that book were like always just like, how are you going to prove that, he's actually unhappy? And Socrates, who's being tortured on the rack, the example goes, is actually but just is the most happiest person ever. So like how
Yeah.
the hell are you going to prove that? And so like Plato himself recognizes this difficulty. So I don't think I'm just imposing this or being like stubborn, right? I think it's recognized throughout these dialogues. So like I just find it dissatisfying. We had this very sort of community oriented ethics that was described, that was very humble and modest, but here it's like, oh, but if you do the right thing, you'll have the most pleasure and be happier. Which, first of all, it comes back to this egotistic approach that people criticize ancient ethics for. And secondly, it just doesn't seem true. You have to establish that connection, and like both empirically and both like just conceptually, there's no conceptual connection necessarily. And empirically, it doesn't seem necessarily true that this happens. So if I may though, I just want to, again, I'm just trying to figure out this text myself and trying to make most sense of it as possible. And the thing that I actually found quite significant is there's a kind of divider which he puts between this discussion of pain and pleasure and the previous discussion. So he says at 732e, I'll just read this really short paragraph. So now then, from the point of view of religion, we've expounded pretty thoroughly what sort of activities we should pursue and what sort of person the individual ought to be. But we have not yet come down to the purely secular level, but we must, because we are addressing men, not gods. And then from then on, then he's going to talk about all the like pain and pleasure stuff. Like literally the entire discussion turns into pain and pleasure. It's like totally different. So I find it interesting, right? Like I think it's significant that the previous discussion we had about that collective ethos, he calls it the point of view of religion. And then when he switches to pain and pleasure, he explicitly flags here that we're now at the purely secular level, because I think this is quite important in interpreting this. So I actually looked up other translations. So the other translations interpret, so here we says, the translation says the point of view of religion, but in other translations, it says, in the Reeves translation, the other Hackett translation, says those were the ethics in the province of the gods. And then the Perseus translation says that those are the ethics of divine sanction. And then regarding the secular point of view, the Reeves translation translates as those in the human province. And the Perseus translation says that these are the practices. It says that those are the human origin. So instead of purely secular, it says they are the human origin. So what are we to make of this divide? I don't know. I guess I'm just posing this as a question, because there seems to be actually the ungenerous view would be that Plato is just totally contradicting himself, because he was like, we should be selfless. And when you're acting virtuously, it should be about the good itself, not about you. It's not about you in the end. It's about the good. It's about doing the good thing, doing the right thing. The explanation doesn't come down to your, happiness. Then he switches to the so-called secular explanation, and it becomes about your pain and pleasure and your happiness. And in fact, at the very end of this section, he even says things like, it makes you more beautiful and stuff like that, which seems like was precisely what he was criticizing at the very beginning of book 5, right? He says like beauty should rank lower. Like anyone who thinks beauty is more important is like, it's not good. So
physical beauty.
Physical beauty, yeah. But I think here he's talking about physical beauty too at the very end of the section, because he says makes for beauty an upright posture.
I think he's talking more about the soul there, I think. But I really like the way you highlighted 732E, and I really should have put that in the notes actually. And it was really helpful that you looked up those different translations, because I had a problem with the word religion and secular, because I think those concepts would not have been present in Plato's time. And I think the translator, this version was translated in the 1950s. That was probably more understood at that time. I had a real problem with that word, but I really liked the way you introduced the idea of, kind of the realm of the gods versus the realm of man. And maybe it's this divide between the realm of being, which we can't access physically. We have no empirical access to the realm of being. It's just the eternal realm, which is the basis of the entire universe, which our sense of reason has access to, but we have no physical access to it, versus the realm of becoming. And the realm of becoming is the realm of humans, where everything's in this constant state of change, and we are always challenged with measurement in that constant state of change. So I think that was really helpful. And as you say, I mean, certainly it's one thing to say one should be virtuous, but quite another thing to put into practice. I really like here, it's at 731A. We have a lot of competition in the world now, of course. We're all competing for status and wealth and survival. And he says at 731A, we want everyone to compete in the struggle for virtue in a generous spirit, because this is the way a man will be a credit to his state, by competing on his own account, but refraining from fouling the chances of others by slander. And maybe this is what we engage in a little bit now too. I think also this part that I have highlighted in the screen, the part that I read beginning at 733E, in the licentious life, the pains exceed the pleasures in point of size, number, and frequency. I think we can see examples of such people who lead these types of licentious lives. They tend to be very wealthy. They tend to be very public. And we can look at these people and say, I really wouldn't want to live like that. It doesn't matter how much money there is involved. I really wouldn't want to live with those pains that, really exceed the pleasures. The pleasures are temporary. The pains are permanent. That's the thing that he's calling attention to here. Yeah, lots of good points about the practicality of it all, I think, is that's the challenge. That's really the challenge. And I'll get into that in our next reading in terms of the purging. So thanks. And we'll go to Fred.
I'd point out that he makes the same distinctions, I think, in 726 to 728, where he does have this hierarchy of honor that pertains to our behavior. And the first rank is given to the gods, the second rank is given to the soul, and the third rank is given to the body. And in all cases, the ideal honor is that which is balanced, like the golden mean between extremes. So I suppose that we could take, when he talks about the first rank being given to the gods in 726, that would be the religious, in quotes, and perhaps the second or third rank of the soul and the body would be secular. So it's almost in passing that Plato suggests that, well, of course, we have to be deferential to the gods, number one. But more to the point, I'm going to spend all my time talking about gods. He spends most of his time expounding these secular notions. So it's like he's just nodding to the gods here, sort of, and then further developing the secular notions of how we achieve honor to the soul and the body. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on this notion that the religious is paramount, because I don't think he develops that. It is true, yeah, he says that, and it's part of his philosophy, but he doesn't develop it very much, as far as I can tell, but I haven't read the whole thing.
Well, thank you. And that, I think, is helpful to remind us of that sort of hierarchy, the God, the soul, and then the body. And so, yeah, I think if we read the reference to religious, or however else it might be translated, I think if we just think of that as, the realm of the gods, whereas we are not in that realm, we are in the secular or not godly realm, but we look at the gods as our patterns and we attempt to come as close to them as we can. So I think that's very helpful. Thank you. And Darren.
So just two things I want to say about this. So regarding that first ethical, more community-centered approach to ethics that's about the good itself rather than your good, it's about goodness itself, right? So it is. So as I just read, it said it's a point of view of religion. It says it's in the realm of the gods and they are of divine sanction. So it is definitely being flagged as a higher sort of view, or high, or maybe more closer to the ethical truth. So the first thing I want to say is, but it's not like we shouldn't aspire to that. Maybe that's obvious, right? But it is sort of harder to reach, maybe even harder to understand, because maybe people are strongly motivated pain and pleasure, as actually the text later on like explicitly says. That's like the strongest motivation for people. But another bit of evidence for this is, so if you just look at the context of that little bit I just read about the secular versus the religious view, I'm trying to find it again. Sorry. Oh, here we go.
732.
Yeah, I got it again. Thanks.
Yeah.
So yeah, so in that context is actually interesting, because actually just above that, literally right above it, he's talking about how we should avoid extreme joy and grief because we should take hope in that the gods will help us. So he said we should not consider that, the difficulties are insurmountable or whatever. And then he says we should always have the hope that the blessings God sends will decrease the troubles that assail us, change our present circumstances for the better, and make us lucky enough to see our good fortune always increase. These are the hopes that every man should live by. He must remember all this advice and never spare any effort to recall it vividly to his own mind and that of others at work and in leisure times alike. The virtuous person who lives according to higher kind of ethics will also have this hope, he's saying. And so yeah, it is kind of religious in a way, and that it's a very high aspiration, and it requires this kind of faith that we could do it. So okay, so that's the first thing. Sorry, I'm going a bit long. Okay, I'll say the second thing. I'm trying to make this a bit quicker. Is that okay, so at 735a, he uses the metaphor of weaving, and he says you can't construct the warp and the wood from the same stuff. And so you need the warp has to be a superior type of material, strong and firm in character, while the woof is softer and suitably workable. And so in suitable ways, we must distinguish between authorities and, the citizens whose education has been slighter and less testing. Actually, I think this is like, I think there's a connection here. I mean, I wish it was clearer maybe, but like he's saying that a society is built with this weaving between these stronger, firmer characters, which I think are like the more religious types that are being discussed, so-called religious, and then sort of the softer kinds, which seems to be maybe the people who might more adhere to secular ethics. I think this is a way of, again, like maybe making these two parts, these two views of ethics, I think are intention. Like one is very other oriented to the good itself, and the other just ultimately tends to be very self-oriented. But he's saying a society consists of this weaving of these two kinds of characters. So I think, although it's not very explicit, I think maybe he's presenting two sets of ethics because there's a kind of realistic understanding that there are sort of these two general dispositions and kinds of people. Like some people just feel justice really strongly, and some people just have that very strong sense of what's right and what's just, and you have to do it. And other people are just more like, more practical. And I'm not making a judgment of, who's better or not here. I'm just saying that there are these kinds of people, and a way of understanding why this tension exists is that Plato recognizes in reality this tension exists. So he's slyly presenting two different approaches, and so there's a kind of pleasure and pain approach that's more utilitarian and available to people who are maybe more practical minded. Yeah, so anyway, I just thought I'll bring that weaving metaphor into.
Yeah. And thank you, because I actually have that on the screen. That's what that's what I will read next, is that part about the weaving. And it was interesting when you said that this idea of hope and needing to have some faith. And I think that's really why I started doing this series on the laws with book 10, because it focused on the logic of why the universe itself is centered on reason. And so if one appreciates that logic, then one can have faith that there is reason in the universe, that it's not just a random process and one needs to engage in a endless competition because it's a contest of the strongest against the weakest. So I think that's maybe some of the basis for this hope, is what is talked about in book 10, that very powerful idea that reason existed before the physical universe, and the physical universe came to be after reason, and it came to be for reason. And we have access to reason with our souls. Reason is part of the three-part Platonic soul. It moderates need and desire. So it's a powerful view. And I think I like that way that you said have faith, but it's a faith based on that understanding of how the universe came to be. So thank you for that. And before I go on to read the next section, we'll go to Ella and then Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, along the lines that were just being referenced, Kierkegaard also recognizes that this sort of terrain exists where, you have different levels. You have the secular, he refers to 3 levels, not 2. As Darren mentioned, Kierkegaard has 3: the aesthetic level, the ethical level, and the religious level. So the aesthetic level is very broad for Kierkegaard. He refers to the aesthetic often as the poet, but it can be anything that's distracting, materialism, anything that distracts one from God. And then he has the ethical level, which is one who strives for the ethics, but may or may not be religious. And you could think of Kantian types of adherents, or anyone who's ethical, but isn't necessarily religious. And then the religious level for Kierkegaard, that's having the deepest sense of ethics in relationship to God. And Kierkegaard says that to love one's neighbor, and one's neighbor is everyone universally, to love one's neighbor, it's important to have the relationship to love oneself. And to love God, and God is in the middle term for Kierkegaard, in the middle, and then that enables you to love one's neighbor. And it's, he indicates, as was indicated earlier in this discussion, it's very difficult because we're humans. We're not gods, we're humans. And it's very difficult to do this task of loving everyone. And for Kierkegaard, it's about loving self, loving God, and loving neighbor. And I would also add that I agree that reason would seem to be inherent in trying to move toward this goal, just really important in moving toward the goal of resolving some of this conflict toward more embracing one another. So, and perhaps not even love, but just some sort of compatibility and coherent society where everyone respects one another. So that would be a good aim. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's great. I think really interesting to have the three levels of Kierkegaard to consider in this context, because I think when you talked about loving yourself can translate into loving your neighbor, it's almost in a way, I think, what Plato is saying here at the beginning of book 5 in terms of honoring the soul. And if you honor the soul, then you love the soul. And if you love the soul and you understand that everybody has a soul, and your soul is really part of this continuum of souls in the universe. And so drawing that distinction between yourself and everybody else, that starts to blur. And I think it causes all sorts of different, more beneficial behavior. And it's really interesting to think, yeah, the aesthetic, that's kind of the appreciation for the physical universe, but I think it's maybe not forming our final judgments based on our measurements of the physical universe, because our ability to measure the universe, the physical universe, is incomplete. So it's a really interesting idea. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And we'll go to Mike.
Sure. Quick question based on what Darren had mentioned about how ultimately it kind of benefits the self, that when we're in a society, helping society, it benefits the self as well. I think it was 732D. And perhaps faith might be the word that we're looking for, because I noticed that when we are within a community and we are helping others, we are selfless and we're just naturally kind of working within a community. It is self-sustained, and you kind of just notice that without any intention that it is benefiting yourself. However, when you're separated from society, you may feel the pain or the dissonance within the distance of a community, and then you will make the rational, or you will have the intention of, hey, if I am back in society, then I will become happy. So I think kind of just maybe not even a question, but just a comment is that if you are from without, separated from society, and your intention is to be happy, basically you understand that that's how a community works, and that you should be from within a society because it's just a self-sustaining system. However, when you're separated, you have the intention of becoming happy. So it's kind of like the intention changes, which I thought might be kind of unethical in a sense, but yeah, just a small comment.
It's a really helpful observation. I think the idea too that community can lead to happiness because, as you said, it's self-sustaining, and it's maybe less of a struggle to maintain oneself if one joins the community and partakes in the community maybe. And that's something that we might consider, I think, is, as we're talking here about how to operate in a community, none of us is capable of operating entirely on our own. So we need a community to some extent. And I guess the question is, do we try to minimize the community, or do we try to empower the community, I guess, and be part of that empowered community with a virtuous leader and with a virtuous citizenship? So really interesting. Thank you. Fred, and then Darren.
It seems to be this tension in Plato between the ideal and our behavior as mere humans. There's this obsession, for example, in Greek sculpture, like with the discus thrower, of portraying the ideal form. But in practice, the ethical attribute is sort of moderation, and not so much obsession, but just finding the medium between two different poles. So it's as if the Greeks, and this does relate to this juxtaposition of the religious and the secular. It's almost as if for the Greeks, we strive for the ideal, but we settle for moderation. And that's a separation from the gods, in particular, because we can never achieve the ideal of immortality of the gods. but nevertheless, we can strive to at least make our actions acceptable to the gods, whatever that might mean in Greek society. In that case, it can be distinguished from what Ella brought up, which is an interesting contrast, where with Kierkegaard, there's a kind of a radical subjectivity that fosters a direct, intuitive relationship with God based on faith. And you don't get that in Greek society. You don't get that kind of direct relationship with the gods unless, Jupiter comes down and impregnates you. But that's a different story. But in general, they're so distant that we may aspire or honor the gods, but in practice, we just kind of settle for, okay, do your best and don't be an extremist. Just do your best and kind of get along and be virtuous to your fellow beings to the extent that you can. But set aside this notion that will be an ideal, because that kind of idealism leads to a kind of aestheticism, which I think that Aristotle eschews. And I wonder if you could give your opinions on that. Thanks.
Yeah, good point. And there's actually, I think it's in this next reading that I have where the Athenian actually talks about that, is that we seek the ideal, but we have to settle at maybe less than the ideal, but realizing that everything that we see is a representation of the ideal. And as you said, looking for the median in that, some sort of a golden ratio that we can follow, that it shows us the path to the ideal, but we'll never reach the ideal, but we can certainly follow the path to the ideal. So I think there's a part when they talk about purging the community, about the ideal purge, which the absolute dictator could do and simply dictate that certain people must leave. And then the practical purge, which is by a leader who doesn't have dictatorial powers, but that practical purge could lead to perfectly acceptable results too. So I think that's the idea of dealing with that tension, that we can never achieve the ideal, but being time-bound beings in this realm of becoming, we can follow that path. And so I think that's, I really like the way that you raise that. So hopefully that addresses the question to some extent. And we'll go to Darren.
All right, so just two quick things. Just in response to Mike, I just want to suggest something, and for anyone else who's interested, regarding this self-absorption objection to certain approaches to ethics and virtue. I personally think it's really interesting because you hear this a lot, and people just say it if it's self-evidently true that virtue is for your own happiness. But there actually is a lot of interesting work objecting to this whole approach, that the point of ethics is your own is your own pleasure or happiness or eudaimonia or whatever else. Thomas Herka has actually done a lot of, he's a philosophy professor at the University of Toronto. He's done a lot of great work on this, and his book on virtue, Vice, and Value, especially the last chapter, is just excellent on this. And the discussion is really interesting. He presents different views, and it's very in-depth, but just I personally find it really fascinating kinds of arguments back and forth about this, where the self-absorption happens when he says what the agent cares about is not so much other people as himself caring about other people. It's actually a kind of subtle thing in our own psychology sometimes, but there is this phenomenon where people get captured by this particular ethical view. What is good is no longer about the other person's good, but whether I'm doing the virtuous thing for the other person so that I can be happy or eudaimonic or whatever. And Herka is saying there's actually something vicious about that, because you're acting so-called virtuously, but it's actually not about the other person's good in the end. Ultimately, it comes back to your own good. And so there's something very distorted about this approach to ethics. And so anyway, I just want to suggest Thomas Herka's work. He also has other papers you can look at where he writes about this, but he has an entire book about it. And then, okay, the second thing, I'll make this quick. So I just want to come back to this secular versus religious view to ethics. Okay, just a side note, what Ella classified Kant as the secular, but actually I think he could also be religious on Plato's view, because insofar as we understand Plato, his God ultimately it seems like it's logos or reason itself, as we'll see in book 10. He does sort of have this other view about there's all these other gods, but that actually seems to be for all the other people, but his full philosophical view seems to be God is reason itself, which actually is kind of very Kant-like. But anyway, yeah, so regarding the contrast between these two views, perhaps we can reconcile them by understanding society as a weaving of these two kinds of character and views in order to make a harmonious society. I just want to bring the possibility that there are these two kinds of people. We're not all like settled onto the secular view, that there should be people who have this higher, more elevated view, is actually coming back to the analogy of the cave in the Republic. Because the philosopher there who exits the cave and sees the light, he's not supposed to just bask in that and be like happy and like personally content. He's supposed to go back into the cave unwillingly, maybe, in order to help bring the other people out. I haven't read that in a long time, so maybe this is a very crude view of what happened there. But this is precisely a kind of selfless ethics, although you can bask in whatever that metaphor is about, like basking the truth or whatever. But ultimately, they're supposed to go back and help the other people and give up some of those solitary individual pleasures. So that sounds very much like that secular ethics. And then, of course, the people who are in the cave might require more of this other approach, the secular ethics, to sort of draw them higher. I don't know if they'll get drawn out, but they'll get drawn higher of the caves. Anyway, I just thought like, yeah, this contrast between these two ethics might also relate to the analogy of the cave, because there are two kinds of people: the philosopher who goes up and then goes back in, and then the people who are just like stuck inside.
Yeah, that's a great thing to remind us of, and a really good example of how actions that are pursued with a selfish goal are not necessarily virtuous. Whereas the prisoner in the cave who escaped and saw the light, he had to be forced back into the cave. And he was told that if he tells the other prisoners in the cave the truth, that they might want to kill him because they're so invested in this false view of reality that they see that they just simply won't accept what he says. And so this person who has escaped and seen the light, it's his duty to do this completely selflessly. And it's something that's very difficult, but it's the role of a philosopher, I think, which very much is something that wants to be expressed. So just before we go to Fred, I just want to read this part from 735A to 737B, and then Fred, if it's all right, we'll come back to you, if that's right. So here is just, this is where they go on further to talk about the actual mechanism of maintaining virtue in the community. And so the Athenian says, at this point, we may stop expounding the preface to the laws, it now being complete. After the prelude should come the tune, or more accurately, a sketch of a legal and political framework. Now it is impossible, when dealing with a web or any piece of weaving, to construct the warp and the woof from the same stuff. The warp must be of a superior type of material, strong and firm in character, while the woof is softer and suitably workable. In a rather similar way, it will be reasonable to distinguish between the authorities who are going to rule in a city and the citizens whose education has been slighter and less testing. You may assume, you see, that there are two elements in a political system: the installation of individuals in office and equipping those officials with a code of laws. But before all that, here are some further points to notice. Anyone who takes charge of a herd of animals, a shepherd or a cattleman or breeder of horses or what have you, will never get down to looking after them without first performing the purge appropriate to his particular animal community. That is, he will weed out the unhealthy and inferior stock and send it off to other herds, and keep only the thoroughbreds and the healthy animals to look after. He knows that otherwise he would have to waste endless efforts on sickly and refractory beasts, degenerate by nature and ruined by incompetent breeding, and that unless he purges the existing stock, those faults will spread in any herd to the animals that are still physically and temperamentally healthy and unspoiled. This is not too serious in the case of the lower animals, and we need mention it only by way of illustration. But with human beings, it is vitally important for the legislator to ascertain and explain the appropriate measures in each case, not only as regards a purge, but in general. To purge a whole state, for instance, several methods may be employed, some mild, some drastic. And if a legislator were a dictator too, he'd be able to purge the state drastically, which is the best way. But if he has to establish a new society and new laws without dictatorial powers, and succeeds in administering no more than the mildest purge, he'll be well content even with this limited achievement. And that's what I was answering before I was looking for that particular line. Like drastic medicines, the best purge is a painful business. It involves chastisement by a combination of judgment and punishment, and takes the latter ultimately to the point of death or exile. That usually gets rid of the major criminals who are incurable and do the state enormous harm. The milder purge we could adopt is this: when there is a shortage of food and the underprivileged show themselves ready to follow their leaders in an attack on the property of the privileged, they are to be regarded as a disease that has developed in the body politic, and in the friendliest possible way they should be, as it will be tactfully put, transferred to a colony. Somehow or other, everyone who legislates must do this in good time, but our position at the moment is even more unusual. There's no need for us here and now to have resort to a colony or arrange to make a selection of people by a purge. No, it's as though we have a number of streams from several sources, some from springs, some from mountain torrents, all flowing down to unite in one lake. We have to apply ourselves to seeing that the water as it mingles is as pure as possible, partly by draining some of it off, partly by diverting it into different channels. Even so, however you organize a society, it looks as if there will always be trouble and risk. True enough, but seeing that we are operating at the moment on a theoretical rather than a practical level, let's suppose we recruited our citizens and their purity meets with our approval. After all, when we have screened the bad candidates over a suitable period and given them every chance to be converted, we can refuse their application to enter and become citizens of the state. But we should greet the good ones with all possible courtesy and kindness. We should not forget that we are in the same fortunate position as the Heraclids when they founded their colony. We noticed how they avoided vicious and dangerous disputes about land and cancellations of debts and distribution of property. When an old-fashioned state is forced to resort to legislation to deal with these problems, it finds that both having things as they are and reforming them are somehow equally impossible. The only policy left them is to mouth pious hopes and make a little cautious progress over a long period by advancing a step at a time. This is the way it can be done. From time to time, some of the reformers should be themselves great landowners and have a large number of debtors. And they should be prepared in a philanthropic spirit to share their prosperity with those debtors who are in distress, partly by remitting debts and partly by making land available for distribution. Their policy will be a policy of moderation, dictated by the conviction that poverty is a matter of increased greed rather than diminished wealth. This belief is fundamental to the success of a state and is the firm base on which you can later build whatever political structure is appropriate to such conditions as we have described. But when these first steps towards reform falter, subsequent constitutional action in any state will be hard going. Now, as we say, such difficulties do not affect us. Nevertheless, it's better to have explained how we could have escaped them if they had. Let's take it then that the explanation has been given. The way to escape these difficulties is through a sense of justice combined with an indifference to wealth. There is no other route, broad or narrow, by which we can avoid them. So let's adopt this principle as a prop for our state. Somehow or other, we must ensure that the citizens' property does not lead to disputes among them. Otherwise, if people have long-standing complaints against each other, anyone with any sense at all will not go any further with organizing them if he can help it. So I wanted to read that and bring in that water analogy as to this idea of streaming and this idea of creating one lake out of the citizens. The lake would be full of virtuous citizens, or at least citizens who aim for virtue. And they're looking at setting up means where they can create avenues, I guess, where people who are struggling with perhaps, violent passions can realize that there are other ways of acting and other perspectives to see. So I wanted to put that on the table, this kind of idea of purging the community of disharmony and creating a harmonious community that is one that's in tune with virtue. So any thoughts on that or anything else that we've discussed so far? I don't know, Fred, if you would still like to speak. Certainly would have the
No, I
floor.
was stuck on a prior discussion, but this is far more interesting. So I'd
Okay.
like to see what others like Ella have to say, particularly about how the state can, quote, in the friendliest way possible, exile its impoverished citizens to a remote colony. How do you pull that off?
All right. Well, thank you. So we'll come back to you if you like, Fred, and we'll go to Ella.
Well, thank you. Certainly, the wrong way to go about it, in my view, is eugenics. And, the idea of a peaceful shepherd, amongst the hills and letting the flock go where they must to find nourishment is not what is being discussed here. It's about culling the sheep, taking out perhaps the one with shorter leg or whatever, and just having the fittest sheep to exist so that they don't interbreed. The whole thing is been tried before and with disastrous results. So, I can't see it as a reasonable way, rational way of approaching dealing with having a better society. And it's been tried in the US as well. I mean, they had eugenics going on not so long ago, like in the early 1800s.
Yeah.
So
Early 1900s too, I think. Yeah.
yeah, I think it went into the 1900s.
Yeah.
But so the point, and of course, with the Nazis, that goes without saying that it was vicious and evil. But the point is that it has been tried, it hasn't worked. Certainly it isn't ethical. So I would just leave it at that. The whole draining the lake reminds me of something that was said in a campaign, draining the swamp. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yes.
So it's just, but it could go either way. You can't, if you take that attitude that human life is the most important thing and valuing that core human life of anyone, whether they're handicapped or a different religion or a different faith, whatever the case may be, not the finest specimen, whatever that might be, of a human being, that doesn't mean you call the herd, That's just my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And I think you certainly draw attention to what could be a major problem with the wording of this. Certainly, I guess, written before any period of eugenics, but it's only kind of mentioned in passing. He says, we need mention it only by way of illustration, but with human beings, it is vitally important for the legislator to ascertain and explain the appropriate measures in each case, not only as regards a purge, but in general. So the word purge, and I'm wondering again at the translation here, because this is again a 1950s translation. I'm wondering if the word purge is maybe not really intended by Plato, because we certainly have some historical experience with purges that are, absolutely drastic and chilling to think about. So that I wonder about. And he starts with this analogy of calling the herds, and then he says we mention it only by way of illustration. Well, I guess historically in the 2400 years that have intervened, we've seen some unfortunate examples where people have been treated like herds and have been called. And this is something that I think maybe we just, as we read this, maybe to give it the benefit of the doubt, is that this is maybe not what he was trying to say, but he was more, I like the idea of the lake forming, like everybody's kind of sharing the same goal of citizenship. So yeah, you call attention to a very important issue, I think, with this section. Thank you. And Darren.
Yeah, so on this issue, so just first of all, just quick little note. I wrote in the chat that actually, I just looked this up, that Alberta had eugenics until 1972. They were still sterilizing people who were deemed supposedly mentally deficient. So you can look that up, anyone who's interested. All right. And then, so yeah, on this section that James read, I think, to me, I found book 5 in general to be a bit of a hodgepodge. This is just my own perception, just reading it the first time, which seems to jump all over the place. And also, I mean, we should acknowledge it's a bit weird, right? In that the dialogue part completely drops out. And like, this is just literally Athenian is the only speaker in book 5. Okay. let's just say that there's a little bit of oddity there. But I think, like, so just like how I was kind of unsatisfied when I was like reading about the ethics of the soul, and like one kind of very community-centered ethics where it's about, it's not about your own good, it's about what is good, period. What is good itself, like what we should do because it is good, not because it is good for you. And then, of course, then it totally switches, and then it talks about your own pain and pleasure and happiness. I've already explained like how I've sort of made sense of that. And so like there was this part about culling and like purging here that was also, so then we move on to this section, and I found this sort of like, okay, this is a bit weird on the surface, but then okay, so this is how I've at least tried to make sense of it. But okay, before I get there, it could just very well be possible that like thousands of years ago, this idea of purging maybe was more, it was maybe less objectionable. But they had different ideas about some things back then, so it could just be that. But okay, the way I've also tried to make sense of it in more maybe charitable way from my own perspective is that, so he says several things. So he starts his section saying like anyone who takes charge of a herd of animals, that they should first perform a purge. And then later on he says, somehow or other, everyone who legislates must do this in good time, but our position at the moment is even more unusual. There's no need for us here and now to have to resort to a colony or arrange to make a selection of people by a purge. So just like how I thought the previous section, it's really important to pay attention to the subtle contexts and switching of context, like such as between religious and secular, so-called religious and secular. Here, there are subtle things going on here. So like it depends on whether you're starting a new colony. Okay. So if you're just starting a colony, perhaps there are things you could do that wouldn't make sense if you were, as he actually says later on, right? He says, if you're a well-established state, then you actually can't do these things. So I'm assuming that applies to us right now, because he says if you're a well-established state, you can only make little cautious progress over a long period by advancing a small step at a time. So you only can take these sort of like reform measures once you've established. But remember, the laws is about founding a brand new, fresh colony. It's like a blank slate. So like if you gotta like choose the right people, you actually sort of can do it, because it's literally a fresh slate and you can just choose which people you send there. And there's also discussion here about, he says, we are operating at the moment on the theoretical rather than practical level. And we're assuming that people will concede to this. We're presupposing there's certain kinds of people. So I think it's like, although it sounds quite extreme, I think it is important to understand like both the context of this is founding a brand new blank slate colony and how he recognizes there's a distinction between that and an established state. And also secondly, that he's presenting like the highest, the most ideal state. And so later on in the book, which I think we'll probably get to, or James has, I don't know exactly what's coming up in his notes, but he will say later, oh, we're discussing the most ideal state, but our method requires that we also discuss the second best. And he even says the third best. So I guess we're going down this ladder here. But right now we're sort of in a very ideal position, both like literally as in founding a new colony, but also like in terms of principle ideal. Yeah, just paying attention to these like subtle switches of context is quite important in reading book 5, just my view.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. You called attention to this paragraph that started, we should not forget that we are in the same fortunate position as the Heraclids when they founded their colony. They were able to choose the people that they wanted, right? And so this is the same thing as you said, this new colony of Magnesia starting as a blank slate. They're not an already long established state with already established practices and cultural traditions. So they don't necessarily have to deal with all of these problems, but they're raising it in case as if they had to kind of explain what the approach might be. So yeah, I think that's important to remember here. And as you say, there is some interesting things like, why is the Athenian the only one who speaks in this book? That's a really interesting thing. I'm not sure I've heard any commentary on that. And I'd certainly like to go and take a deeper look at the translation of that word purge. I really do, just because of all the historical baggage it's developed over the past 2,400 years. So yeah, we actually have only like literally 10 minutes left in the session, although if folks can stay online for a little bit longer, maybe we can go on a bit, because the next part I wanted to read actually deals with this distribution between members of the colony and this idea of fairness and equity in the distribution of money in particular. And what he ended up saying in this section that I just read, that we must ensure that the citizens' property does not lead to disputes among them. And that's recalling that section from a few books ago talking about the civil strife and the lawsuits. And this is really something that's a major problem now, because this is the economic model that we live in does give rise to all of these disputes about property. It makes a very interesting proposition in the next section that I wanted to read. So if we can stay online for a little bit longer, I do want to get to this section where he talks about the number 5040. So keeping that in mind, we will go to Ella.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a big difference between culling the herd, taking out the weaker sheep, the handicapped sheep or whatever, those that aren't as fast or large or woolly as the others, versus, you're not going to get building a new colony where you're excluded from the get-go. I mean, in both cases, I suppose culling the herd is a little more egregious because you're taking people out of the society that have a belonging there and are a part of it. But in the second case, you're not letting them in the first place. It's still built on a hierarchy and a supremacy. So that's all I had to add. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and very good point to make. I think it is something that is troubling, I think, in this section, and we'll see, maybe as the laws develops, how that's actually going to be practically administered. And Darren mentioned this statement that we are operating at the moment on a theoretical rather than a practical level. And so they realize that there is some practicality in all of this. So let me go on and read this section about the 5040, because this is rather famous in this dialogue. This starts at 737C. It's a relatively short section, but there's some really cool Platonic mathematics and geometry in here. And I think whenever Plato does this, and this is where I put the extensive footnote that I mentioned in my introduction, I think there is something that we're supposed to think about. So here the Athenian says, so what's the correct method of distribution? First, one has to determine what the total number of people ought to be, then agree on the question of the distribution of the citizens and decide the number and size of the subsections into which they ought to be divided. And the land and houses must be divided equally, so far as possible, among these subsections. A suitable total for the number of citizens cannot be fixed without considering the land and the neighboring states. The land must be extensive enough to support a given number of people in modest comfort, and not a foot more is needed. The inhabitants should be numerous enough to be able to defend themselves when the adjacent peoples attack them, and contribute at any rate some assistance to neighboring societies when they are wronged. When we have inspected the land and its neighbors, we'll determine these points and give reasons for the actions we take. But for the moment, let's just give an outline sketch and get on with finishing our legislation. Let's assume we have the convenient number of 5,040 farmers and protectors of their holds. And let the land with its houses be divided up into the same number of parts so that a man and his holding always go together. Divide the total first by 2, then by 3. And there's a reference to evens and odds, by the way, which Plato puts in all of his dialogues. You'll see that it can be divided by 4 and 5 and every number right up to 10. Everyone who legislates should have a sufficient appreciation of the arithmetic to know what number will be most used in every state and why. So let's fix on the same one which has the largest number of consecutive divisors. Of course, an infinite series of numbers would admit all possible divisions for all possible uses, but our 5040 admits no more than 59, including 1 to 10 without a break, which will have to suffice for purposes of war and every peacetime activity, all contracts and dealings, and for taxes and grants. Anyone who is legally obliged to understand these mathematical facts should try to deepen his understanding of them even in his spare time. So I wanted to read that because, as I said, this is kind of the famous and very curious part of this dialogue. How did he come up with the number 5040? And as I said, there is reference to evens and odds here. And if you look at the number of 5040, it's, for example, 7 times the factorial of 6, which is an interesting combination of evens and odds. The reference to an infinite series is quite interesting because that's almost what calculus is, basically dividing a circle into an infinite series of lines. And that came a full 2,000 years after Plato. So there's some interesting concepts here. And also the part that ended there, that anyone is legally obliged to understand these mathematical facts should try to deepen his understanding of them even in his spare time. I think that recalls what Socrates says in the Republic, is that knowledge of number and calculation is kind of the first order of business of a philosopher. So there is definitely some call here to understand some reason behind this. He's not telling us right up front what he's referring to, but I put the idea that this is really some sort of connection to harmonics, because harmony is really key in this colony. So somehow the number 5040 connects to some sort of concept of harmonics. So I think that's something that maybe he's trying to tease us with and trying to get us to really understand and think about what he's saying with the numbers here, that there is some sort of ideal number of connections between the colonists beyond which perhaps understanding and that sense of mutual virtue and not acting selfishly, where that sort of disappears. So maybe part of the issue with our modern society, when we have 7.8 billion people on the planet, is that the mechanisms, the legislative mechanisms, have kind of exceeded the practical extent at which people can understand each other. So Darren, your thoughts?
Yeah, so regarding this fascinating number, I think you're right. It has a lot to do with this idea of harmony, and which we saw, book 5 start with, of how the soul has to be disposed and how we should, relate to our friends and stuff in order to have this harmony. And not just for you as an individual, but as a community. And so this number comes to the fore at the end of book 5 now. And I guess just two little thoughts about this. One is that one thing that we see in this last section of book 5 is that he's establishing a colony, not for, like, his view is not just to get it started and up and running. He says that these arrangements are basically like forever, they're permanent, or as long as we can think. So there's a very long time horizon. And I think it is something to do with how, okay, this actually relates to my second point. So I'll have to make this point too, actually. So I think you touched a bit upon this already. So that, this number, I think what's kind of magical about it is I actually didn't actually do the math, but supposedly it is divisible by all the numbers between 1 and 10 and maybe and others. So it's divisible by a lot of numbers. He actually says, based on this number, we divide the administrative units, the number of villages, and he says all the way down to things like coinage, liquid and dry measures and weights, and a whole bunch of other details, like the proportions of any equipment you use has to conform to this standard. And I think like what's important is precisely because you can divide this number by like so many other numbers. And so, as we saw in that discussion about property and equal distribution of property, this idea of equal distribution and your ability to like equally divide things is so important, because any little bits of inequality can like lead to conflict and dissent and people being unhappy with each other. And that's precisely what he said we want to avoid. We want to maintain friendship. So like you need to begin with a number that can always be perfectly divided, so you never have to worry about little inequalities going out of control. And so this relates back to like the first point I was trying to make about how this is forever. This is for a colony that will like last and last. At least that's the ideal view. He's going to talk about the second and third best too. And the way it can last is to have this number which you can divide things up so equally. And this kind of sharing in things equally is important for this, at least most ideal community. So so this number relates to all this idea of harmony and community.
Yeah, really well said. And I think the idea of avoiding inequality is key. And so when he says that the number 5040 has the largest number of consecutive divisors, that means it's the most flexible way of dividing things, and that the way to avoid conflict, I think, is a key. So he's choosing a number that is the most perfect number in that sense, that the number could lead to justice. And you mentioned it, right at the end of book 5, and this is at 747a. He says he'll assume it's a general rule that numerical division in all its variety can be usefully applied to every field of conduct. As you say, this is not just for a particular length of time. This is for all time. It may be limited to the complexities of arithmetic itself or extended to the subtleties of plane and solid geometry. It's also relevant to sound and to motion, straight up or down, or a revolution in a circle. The legislature should take all of this into account and instruct all his citizens to do their best never to operate outside that framework. So he's really talking about a framework that is prone to the most equal type of division possible. And I think when we reflect on the world now, I think it's generally agreed that inequality has grown tremendously over the past number of decades. And this is certainly causing friction, and conflict and all sorts of unhappiness in the world now. And so here he's trying to create a system that has the greatest possible chance of equality, I think, and therefore potentially the greatest chance of justice among people, and people acting not out of self-interest, but for the betterment of the community. And we can't forget that great line in book 10 where he says, you think that the universe was created for you, but it's quite the opposite way around. You were created for the benefit of the universe. And that's a good thing for you and the universe. And so maybe this is something that we need to understand, some sort of universality of this quantity and this ability to divide. So Darren.
I know we're running out of time. Just a quick comment. So all this discussion of the harmony and harmonics and numbers makes me think of music.
Mhm.
I think this is actually a nice way to tying this book 5 back in with, some of the earlier books. As we know,
Yep.
the first 3 books were about drinking parties
Yeah.
and drinking. So it's interesting because the first education in virtue, as we saw in those books, had to do with education in music, because we heard about how young people, they can't do all the high theory and stuff, right? So we first educate, at least in their virtue, this aspect of them, well, with music and dancing. And so this is getting them to sort of have this, because we know that music is, we saw this also in the Timaeus, that Plato understands music as related to reason itself. He explicitly criticized this view that music is just for like frivolous pleasure. It's actually about it's actually about reason and really important things. It's not just about frivolous pleasures. So I think it's interesting, yeah, that our first education is musical, because maybe that gives us access to this harmony in the world and the universe. And of course, we saw that old people also use music to help drink in order to dance and stuff, and in order for them to, I guess, have some access. I don't know, maybe that's related to music too. But and another connection to music is, I remember in the last, I think this was last time in book 4, we didn't discuss this, but I recall that one of the first things that the primitive people, so after the Great Flood millions of years ago, people have to, start establishing communities and start learning about the world again. One of their most important discoveries, I thought was interesting in that list of things that they started to discover, was one of the most important things that was flagged as music.
Mm.
So wherever that takes them, that millennia later, who knows? But that was really important, re-beginning of human civilization, is this rediscover music. So anyway, I just thought this discussion of harmonics just reminded me of music. So
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that in, because that was certainly key to books 2 and 3, especially. And it does seem that there is this kind of universal appeal of music to humans, and it just seems something that's innate in us, and maybe it's something that's innate in the universe. So interesting thought. Ella.
Yes, I actually like this principle much more than the prior principle in culling the sheep.
Mm.
In this principle, Plato's taking great pains to even construct a universal mathematical sort of fairness quotient in terms of the land and the housing. So I think he is so far, and I haven't read the rest of it, so that's my disclaimer. But so far, I think he's trying to be fair and just. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I love that term, fairness quotient. That's a great term. Thank you. Well, we are out of time. I mean, it has been a great discussion. I wanted to end, I won't read this whole section. I had put the section from 741A to 742B in the notes, but I'll just end by reading the first paragraph of this. And it's talking again about this distribution and avoiding conflicts of distribution of property between the colonists and the Athenians. Says, so let's pretend our thesis can talk and give us this advice. My dear sirs, don't ignore the facts and be careless enough to undervalue the concepts of likeness, equality, identity, and agreement, either in mathematics or in any other useful and productive science. In particular, your first task now is to keep to the said number as long as you live. You must respect the upper limits of the total property which you originally distributed as being reasonable, and not buy and sell your holdings among yourselves. The lot by which they were distributed is a god, so there will be no support for you there, or from the legislator either. And there are 2 warnings the law has for the disobedient. A, you must choose or decline to take part in the distribution, but if you do take part, you must observe the following conditions. 1, you must acknowledge that the land is sacred for all the gods. 2, after priestesses have offered prayers for that intention in the first, second, and third sacrifices, and then here he proposes the first law, anyone buying or selling his allotted land or house must suffer the penalty appropriate to the crime. So it's almost like this allotment is kind of, based in nature. It's some sort of this natural connection of people to the land, and we are maybe not owners of the land, we are tenants on the land. And I think this is maybe, the idea that he discussed, and I didn't get to the reading at 740A, where he says that Earth is a goddess and mistress of mortal men. And it's something that maybe, as I said in the introduction, as we are struggling to figure out how to stop destroying the nature of the planet that sustains us, maybe this kind of view would be helpful. So let's end the recording here. I invite anyone who wants to stay online for a casual half hour and a recorded discussion in Plato's Cafe. You're more than welcome to. But I'll end the recording and I'll invite everyone to come back in 2 weeks' time. So we're going to spend the next 2 meetings focusing on Book 7. So we're going to just present a brief outline of Book 6, which goes into really the details of some of the offices of this colony. So I think maybe we can present that kind of in outline and then really focus on some of the very key concepts of Book 7. Book 7 is a longer book, and it contains some very key concepts, I think, that will help to bring together everything that we've seen so far in the laws. So very much looking forward to that. So if you want to read ahead to Book 7, we'll try to post some notes on Book 6 in advance so that you can see kind of how that's woven into the structure of this colony. So yeah, I hope to see everybody in 2 weeks, and I'll end the recording now and invite everybody who wants to stay online for a casual discussion. Thank you.